Hello, I'm William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, and in this video I'd like to talk about a challenge that students face in our English literature courses. In these literature courses that we offer, we begin with classical literature in English translation, then move to medieval and British and then American. And as the students read through the selected works in these courses, they're required to complete a number of comprehension questions that test their knowledge and understanding of the literature. One of the questions that we ask students requires them to identify examples of figures of speech that are used by the authors in their writings. And this challenge is difficult for most students because they don't get a chance to study advanced grammar and get into figures of speech, and they don't study rhetoric. So they come into literature really unprepared for the study of literature, and there's not much that I can do about that. It takes time, and parents have to enroll the kids in those courses, and they simply don't get a chance to do that. So by the time we get to high school and it's time to study literature, the kids are not in a place intellectually where they're even ready to study literature. And what most schools do in the name of literature is just barely gaining familiarity with books or having some artificial modern ideas about writing that are established by curriculum standards and things like that, used as some kind of framework for these studies. But that's not the real study of literature. That's not how the writers of the great works of literature were taught themselves. That's not what they're actually doing when they write their works. And so the modern literature courses don't help the kids understand what's going on in the works they're reading. And in our English literature courses, I try to do that, even though I might have to work with the kids to understand these things because they don't have the foundation in the classical liberal arts that they need to read great historical literature written by authors who studied the classical liberal arts. That's the dilemma. So what I'd like to do in this video is just talk a little bit about this one question that the kids are asked, so that whether you're a parent or one of the students, you can understand what I'm looking for and what you need to do in order to answer these questions in our English literature courses. Now, if you look at the English literature course page in the Study Center, up at the top of the page you'll see a link to a document that's titled Analysis and Imitation. And that document is a two-page document that contains an overview of the figures of speech that students need to learn about and then look for as they read the works of literature that are studied in our courses. So what I'd like to do in this video is go through this document and just provide a basic explanation of the figures of speech, so that students can know what to look for as they read and can successfully complete these lessons. Before I do that, though, I'd like to just share a point that I make with my students when I help them study literature. There are two kinds of students and two different uses of literature. The one type of student I refer to as just a child, and his aim in reading or watching film or anything else is just to consume content, to be entertained. That's a childish use of literature. That's an ignorant use of literature. Literature is produced, let's say, for sale or to entertain or move an audience. And when we study literature, our goal is not to be that audience. Our goal is to study literature as a work of art, as the work of another human being. And when students learn not to get lost in the work itself, not to merely consume the literature, but to actually think about the human author and the art and skill that he employs in this work of literature, that's when they become the second type of student. They become a student of literature. They become literate. Not that literate means to know a lot of stories, because that's like a person who watches a lot of television. We don't consider them to be cultured because they're familiar with every different TV show and film. What it means to be literate is to understand that literature is the work of a human author, and to pay attention to that author's intention and techniques. That's what we mean by analysis. To analyze literature means to look at a work of literature and understand what the author is doing and how he's accomplishing what he's doing. That's analysis. And the purpose of analysis is so that we can learn from history's greatest speakers and writers and then imitate their skill in our own writing. And that's why this document is called Analysis and Imitation. It teaches us what to look for when we analyze works of literature, and it gives us a guide that we can imitate when hopefully we sit down to prepare something to say or write something ourselves. So the work and study of literature is not to become familiar with stories, which is what many modern schools and students do, but that's not the point. The point is to learn from history's greatest authors and speakers principles of effective communication for our own imitation. That's the goal of the real study of literature. So I'd like to walk through this document on analysis and imitation, and if time allows, provide a few examples, just a few examples, because that would take way too much time. But I'll provide a few examples just from the first pages of our first work in English Literature 1, which is Homer's Iliad. So take a look with me at this document. I'll walk you through it, and I'll explain how to go about reading with this approach to analysis and using this document to answer those questions in our English literature courses. Let's take a look at the document. So you can see the title here is Analysis and Imitation, and there are two sections of this document. The first is titled Figures of Speech on page 1, and then down on the second page we see sentences here as the second division, and that's the end of the document. What I've done on this document is summarize a work titled Studies in English and American Literature that was published back in the 20th century. So you can look up this work here if you want to go into this in more detail. It's a helpful source. But I've summarized the content of that book as far as the figures of speech are concerned. And so let's just walk through it and see what it has to say. I'll pop my image on the screen here so you can follow me. First of all, we see that there are two different kinds of figures of speech. There are grammatical figures of speech that have to do with the grammar of the language of the author, and there are rhetorical figures of speech, which are not grammatical, but deal with more of the purpose and the overall style that the author uses. So two different types of grammatical figures, or two different types of figures of speech, I should say, grammatical figures and rhetorical figures. And these are the things that students should be looking for as they read great works of literature, because they'll be found in the writings of all of history's best authors. So looking at the grammatical figures up here, and I'll just get myself out of the way. Looking at the grammatical figures, the first one we see is ellipsis. Ellipsis is the first grammatical figure, and we see that there are two kinds of ellipsis. The first kind is the ellipsis of letters, which is the omission of letters or words as are necessary to complete the sense and construction. This is normally done to affect the rhythm and meter of language. So we would normally find this in poetry, and we'll find this all through our readings in English literature. Normally it's in poetry, but sometimes it is used in prose by authors who are concerned with making their prose flow more smoothly. All right? And we see that with regard to ellipsis, where we have letters omitted in writing, we see there are three different kinds. And they've got some fancy names, which I'll teach you the pronunciation of. The first one is apheresis. Apheresis. It's the omission of a letter or letters from the beginning of a word. And you can see the word is simply started with an apostrophe. Okay? And it says here that these are used for the sake of rhythm and meter, but sometimes they're just used for an effect. Like if we're quoting the words of some uneducated person who might talk with slang, and we omit letters for the sake of representing his improper language. Okay. Another one is syncope. Syncope is the omission of a letter or letters from the middle of the word, and we see an example here of loved. And then apocope. Apocope is the omission of a letter or letters at the end of a word, as though, with an apostrophe for though. So we see three simple kinds of ellipsis, and you can see that the differences between them, while they have fancy names, they're simple to understand. Ellipsis just means the omission of letters from words, and it can happen at the beginning of a word, in the middle of a word, or at the end of a word. So it's really not that complicated. But that's ellipsis, ellipsis of letters. And then secondly, ellipsis of words in part B here. Ellipsis of words. And we can use ellipsis or find ellipsis where different parts of speech have been omitted for some rhetorical effect. We can find relative pronouns left out. We can find conjunctions left out. We can find entire clauses left out. So ellipsis simply means leaving things out of speech to have some effect through that speech, through that, I would say, unnatural speech, which is artificial and intended to have some effect on the reader. That's ellipsis. Second, this word here is pronounced analogy, analogy, and don't get it confused with analogy. This is analogy. Okay, so analogy, not to be confused with analogy. Analogy signifies a change of words. The two most common forms of analogy are the following: changing one part of speech for another. And if we read this sentence, we read, "The wind blows soft o'er Ceylon's isle." And we might ask, what word has been changed? Because for many readers, they'll read this and see that everything looks fine. But what's happened is the adverb softly has been replaced with an adjective, soft. This is not proper grammar. The wind blows soft. It should be the wind blows softly, but this change is made intentionally to affect the speech, to affect the reader. We also see an example here of syncope, where we see the word over has the V dropped in the middle of the word. That's what syncope is. So this sentence that they give here actually contains two different figures of speech. It contains analogy in using the adjective soft rather than softly, and it uses syncope in dropping the V out of over, and you can hear the effect that changing over from a two-syllable word to a one-syllable word has on the sentence. The wind blows soft o'er Ceylon's isle. Compare that to what it would sound like if we said, "The wind blows soft over Ceylon's isle." It makes it a little smoother, which was the author's intention. Okay, so two examples there, but you can see what analogy is with regard to changing one part of speech for another. Secondly, to change one case for another. So analogy is simply changing words to have some overall rhetorical effect, and it's considered a grammatical figure of speech. Lastly, number 3, pleonasm. Pleonasm consists in the use of more words than are necessary, intentionally using more words to have some effect on the reader. So those are the 3 important grammatical figures of speech. Ellipsis, the omission of letters or words. Analogy, the changing of words. And then pleonasm, the use of additional unnecessary words to have some effect. So if a sentence could be simplified and said with fewer words, we should usually understand that the author, being a master writer, would probably know that and would use those extra words intentionally. Those are the 3 grammatical figures that students should learn to keep an eye out for. Then we have the rhetorical figures. These are more commonly known than the grammatical figures simply because most students don't get a chance to study advanced grammar, as I said before. The rhetorical figures begin with simile, which is the most simple and obvious. It's a comparison that usually uses the words like or as. And they give us an example. Friendship is like the sun's eternal rays. So the use of the words like or as normally identify a simile, a comparison. Metaphor is another kind of comparison. It's an implied comparison. So the comparison is not made explicit. A metaphor is an implied comparison or an abridged simile. And we have an example in Athens, the eye of Greece, the mother of arts and eloquence. So it doesn't say that Athens is like an eye. It says Athens is the eye of Greece. It's an implied comparison. It's like saying Athens is to Greece what the eye is to the body. Athens is to the arts what a mother is to a child. It's an implied comparison, or a comparison that doesn't include the exclusive or the explicit use of the words like or as. An implied comparison. All right? Then we have antithesis. Antithesis is a comparison based upon contrast. Antithesis is a comparison based upon contrast. Ignorance is the curse of God. Knowledge, the wing wherewith we fly to heaven. The use of this comparison by setting up a contrast. Ignorance is this, whereas knowledge, the opposite, is this. That's antithesis. Comparing by setting up a contrast. Next, allegory. Allegory is an extended metaphor. So it takes the basic idea of a metaphor and extends it into a much more detailed comparison. And they use The Pilgrim's Progress as an example. That's a Protestant book that you might not be familiar with. The whole entire book is an allegory of the Christian life. We're given 2 examples of allegory, parables. We have good examples of these obvious in the Gospels. Jesus Christ, the Lord, when he becomes man and walks among us and teaches, makes use of figures of speech. That's very important. It shows us how essential the use of figures of speech are, that when God himself became man and needed to teach about the kingdom of God and the way of salvation, he did so by means of rhetorical figures. That's how significant rhetorical figures are. We could say, rhetorical figures, they're not very important. It's just human learning or human wisdom, men trying to be fancy in their speech. But that's false. If God himself became a man, he would communicate using rhetorical figures. That's how essential they are to human communication. So we have parables used in the life of Jesus. We also have fables, as we see in Aesop's fables. Fables are used to tell a story that illustrates some issue that wishes to be explained. It's an extended metaphor. So if we think of Aesop's fables, a man could give a simple moral teaching, like look before you leap. That could be a simple moral teaching and itself would be a rhetorical figure. But to extend that figure, to extend it and to tell a whole story that illustrates the comparison, that's the work of allegory. So allegory is the fourth rhetorical figure. Number 5, metonymy. Metonymy is a figure in which one object is described by the name of another. Metonymy is a figure in which one object is described by the name of another. And we see that there are 4 kinds of metonymy. First, we can use the cause to describe the effect. We can use the cause for the effect. Jesus said to his hearers, "You have Moses and the prophets." And that, of course, is not really true. The Jews did not have Moses and the prophets with them. Jesus is using a rhetorical figure. He's speaking with metonymy. He's using the cause to signify the effect. He says Moses and the prophets, but what he's actually referring to are the writings of Moses and the prophets. This is an example, again, in the teaching of Jesus himself of the use of a figure of speech, the use of metonymy. In the other direction, we can use an effect to describe a cause. The sentence, "There is death in the cup." Well, that's not actually true. It's simply a rhetorical figure. We're describing the disease or the poison in the cup by its effect, referring to it as death. Death is not, of course, in the cup. A poison might be in the cup, but its effect is death. And so rhetorically, in order to have a certain effect on the audience, we could say, "There is death in the cup." And you can feel that that's more dramatic. Third, another kind of metonymy is to use the container for the contents. The container for the contents. The miser loves his purse. Now, the miser doesn't actually love his purse. He loves what is contained in the purse. But the purse is used as a figure of the money or the contents of the purse. This is an example of metonymy. And then lastly, a sign for its object. A sign used to refer to its object or what it signifies. The pen is the civilizer of the world. The pen is the civilizer of the world. Now, obviously, that's not true. A pen does not civilize the world. It's what a pen signifies. The pen signifies persuasive writing or communication. It's that persuasive communication which civilizes the world, but it can be signified by referring to the pen, which is a sign of the object. This is another kind of metonymy. So this is another type of figure of speech students should be looking for. Sixth, synecdoche. Synecdoche. Synecdoche is a figure in which a name is given to an object that suggests more or less than we intend. A name given to an object that suggests more or less than we intend. And there are 2 different kinds of synecdoche. We can use a part to refer to the whole. We can use a part for the whole, as in the sentence, "No European keel had entered the harbor." The keel is a part of a boat. We can use a part to name or represent the whole. No European keel had entered the harbor. That is, no European boat. A common example of this might be a mother saying, "Do not step foot in this house." I want no feet in this house until the work outside is done. Or in the military, to put boots on the ground is an example of synecdoche. We can also use a whole to refer to the part. All the world wondered. This is obviously an exaggeration. The whole world didn't wonder, only a part of the world, but by synecdoche, the whole is used to speak of a part. That's the sixth of these rhetorical figures. Next, personification, which is commonly known. Personification is where we attribute, we use attributes of living things to describe things that are inanimate or not living, that do not possess those attributes. We can do this with an adjective, which is a descriptive word, or with a verb, which speaks of some action. We can give a descriptive term or a quality to a non-living thing that it doesn't actually possess, or we can use a verb to describe the action of some non-living thing which it's not actually capable of. In the use of an adjective, we have the example, the rippling, laughing brooks flow merrily on. And we see this use of laughing and merrily to refer to the running of water. Water cannot laugh. In fact, laughing is a peculiarity of man. Water cannot laugh, and water cannot be merry, but it can have the appearance of laughing and moving merrily. This is an example of personification. And then as a verb, how sweet the moonlight sleeps upon this bank. Moonlight cannot sleep. Sleeping belongs only to animals or animate objects. The moon is not animate, and therefore this is an example of personification. Number 8, apostrophe. Apostrophe is a figure in which the absent, something or someone that is absent, is addressed as though present. Apostrophe. And we have two examples. Pure apostrophe, where David cries out and says, Absalom, I would God I had died for thee. Absalom was dead, and David spoke to him by means of apostrophe as a rhetorical figure. He spoke to Absalom as if he was present. Second example, another type of apostrophe is combined with personification. Roll on, thou deep and dark blue ocean, roll. Here we see ocean spoken to as if present in person, and we have a combination of personification by making the ocean appear as a person and then speaking to that ocean, though no such person is present, as if he is present. So we see a combination of personification and apostrophe. So that's the 8th rhetorical figure. Hyperbole is the 9th. Hyperbole is a figure in which the object is either exaggerated, either spoken too much of, or is disparaged, spoken too little of. Hyperbole. We have an example, the diamonds in thine eyes might furnish crowns for all the queens of the earth. In other words, your eyes are sparkling and are so beautiful that we could take the diamonds, the luster from your eye, and use it to adorn the crowns for queens. That's obviously an exaggeration. That's hyperbole. There are no actual diamonds in the woman's eyes. It's simply a figure of speech. Number 10, irony. Irony is a figure employed to express the opposite of the idea entertained. Make sure you understand that irony is not coincidence. Many people use the word irony to refer to things that are simply coincidental. Irony is a figure employed to express the opposite. It's intentionally stating the opposite of what is intended or signified. Irony. When Mark Antony in Julius Caesar said, Brutus is an honorable man, he was saying that sarcastically. He was saying that in criticism of Brutus after Brutus had killed Caesar. He's saying Brutus is an honorable man, but he means exactly the opposite. It's a rhetorical effect being used in the play to stir up the crowd to anger against the men who conspired and killed Julius Caesar. That's an example of irony. To state the opposite of what is intended is irony. 11th, climax. Climax is a figure in which the strength of thought increases to the close of a sentence. So there's a typo there. Climax is a figure in which the strength of the thought increases to the close of the sentence. And we have an example. The stream of literature has swollen into a torrent, augmented into a river, expanded into a sea. This is an example of the figure of climax, where the author begins with a simple description, then says it's increased to something greater, and then to something even greater, to build up that effect over the course of the sentence. This is climax. And then lastly, the 12th rhetorical figure is alliteration. Alliteration. The repetition of the same initial sound or letter amid the lingering light. Lingering light. The use of this repeated sound is often intentional, and we can see examples of this in our reading of Homer. That's alliteration, the repetition of, I would say, not the initial letter, but the initial sound. Alliteration. So those are the 12 rhetorical figures of speech that we're looking for. We studied 3 grammatical figures, ellipsis, analogy, and pleonasm, and we studied 12 rhetorical figures, simile, metaphor, antithesis, allegory, metonymy, synecdoche, personification, apostrophe, hyperbole, irony, and climax, and lastly, alliteration. Those are the 12 rhetorical figures. Now, the rest of this here deals with sentences and different forms of sentences as can be used for rhetorical effect. That's not nearly as important, and I don't really expect students to get much into that. But these are the things, these rhetorical and grammatical figures of speech, these are the things that I'm really looking for in our study and analysis of literature in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. So if students would study this, study these examples, ask for help if they need help understanding them, and use this as a guide to analyze and study the great works of literature, they'll begin to study these works with some wisdom and understanding, and actually gain the benefit of the study of literature. So that's what I wanted to look at with regard to this document, and that document is linked, like I said, to the top of the page in our English literature course. Now, the other thing I want to do, let me just pull this up real quick. I'd like to just take a minute and walk through the opening page or so of Homer's Iliad and see some examples. So let's actually go to Homer's Iliad and see if we can find some examples of figures of speech. I have it ready here on the screen, so let's flip over to there and take a look. This is just book 1 of Homer's Iliad. And let's read the first paragraph or so. Achilles' wrath to Greece the direful spring, of woes unnumbered, heavenly goddess, sing. And so right here in the first line, we have the wrath of Achilles. And it's said to be the source of unnumbered woes to Greece. And of course, it's not Achilles' wrath that was the source of those woes. It was the actions that Achilles took. His wrath is the cause, and the cause is used to describe the effect. This is an example of metonymy right off the bat in the opening line of the Iliad. The wrath which hurled, right here we see, we've already seen 2 actually. We see an example of syncope, where the abbreviation or the letter is omitted from the middle of a word. Syncope, we see it here also in unnumbered, where these letters are dropped in order to make sure the reader reads these words as a single syllable for the sake of the meter of the poetry. The souls of mighty chiefs untimely slain, whose limbs unburied on the naked shore, devouring dogs and hungry vultures tore. Since great Achilles and Atrides strove, such was the sovereign doom, such the will of Jove. Back here, referring to Pluto's gloomy reign, this is an example of a rhetorical figure where Pluto's gloomy reign is used to refer to death or the underworld. Declare, O Muse, in what ill-fated hour sprung the fierce strife, from what offended power? Latona's son a dire contagion spread, and heaped the camp with mountains of the dead. Here's an example of hyperbole. There were obviously not mountains of dead bodies. That's an exaggeration for rhetorical effect. Mountains of the dead is hyperbole. We have another example here of syncope, a vowel being dropped from heaped. The king of men, his reverend priest defied, and for the king's offense the people died. The king of men is another rhetorical figure, being an exaggeration, the whole for a part. Agamemnon was not the king of all men, he was the king of the Greeks, but this is a rhetorical figure. Chryses sought with costly gifts to gain his captive daughter from the victor's chain. Victor's chain here is an example of metonymy. The chain is a sign of slavery or servitude, and it's used here to describe that servitude. So, in just a few minutes, you can see that I've already pointed out a number of rhetorical figures. That's how common they are in the works of literature. What I ask students to do is, as they read, have these rhetorical figures in mind and go through the reading and try to pay attention to them as you go. You can see that even as I read just a dozen or so lines, as I was reading, I was already skipping some because they're so common and present in almost every line that you've got to be careful because they're hard to even notice. We just take them for granted because they come so naturally and we're so accustomed to reading them. But the writings are filled with rhetorical figures. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit before I finish here. It's just about 38 minutes in. I'd like to talk a little bit about, why the authors use these rhetorical figures. We might think that because we can distill or draw from these writings this list of rhetorical figures, that the authors must have studied this list and then consciously and artificially used them in their writing. But that's really not how this works. Persuasive people who are great speakers, people who are great writers, they don't necessarily need to do these things artificially. If they're gifted with just a spirit that is persuasive and influential and creative, they may do things instinctively or naturally that are effective on their audiences. And when we study them, we ask the question, why are they so effective? What about that book is it that causes people to like it so much? What is it about this speaker or this writer that's so influential? What's the secret? What's the key to the influence that they have? And when philosophers, because this was an object of study of philosophers, men like Aristotle back in the ancient world, when these philosophers would observe great influential speakers, they would study to try and figure out what it is that's so influential, and they were the ones who drew from those authors and speakers these habits or techniques that they noticed them using all the time and made a list of them to create an art of rhetoric that could be studied and practiced by others. The original authors, however, didn't pursued these things artistically, or artificially, I should say. They didn't study the art and then practice it. They practiced it naturally by their own gift of eloquence and influence in their speaking and writing. So there are people who are gifted in these things. There are people who are naturally influential and motivating and persuasive in their speech. And when we study them and try to understand why they're so influential, what is it about this person or this author that just draws us and has such a profound effect upon our thoughts or our emotions, we'll find that it's these rhetorical figures that are used, again, not artificially, but naturally, as they communicate. Did Jesus use parables because he studied rhetoric? No. Jesus used parables because he was an effective communicator and master teacher. And as he sought to influence his hearers in an effective way, he naturally used rhetorical figures. We don't know that he used them artificially, but it's not necessary that he did so. But it teaches us that even God himself, when he communicates to us all through the scriptures, and even in person in the incarnation, speaks to human beings in figures of speech, rhetorical and grammatical figures. So that's something profound to think about. And the great writers and speakers of history do the same thing. Some of us are gifted with ability to persuade and motivate and rouse people to action or whatever else effect we might seek in our communication. Others are not so gifted. But the art of rhetoric gives us the opportunity to study the techniques of the masters and then to some degree imitate them in our own communication. That's what we're seeking to learn as we study literature. Why is Homer famous, 2,800 years after he wrote? There are reasons why he's famous, and as we read his works, you'll see that they are loaded with rhetorical figures because he is an extremely persuasive and eloquent speaker and writer. So when we study literature, we're seeking to learn these things, analyze the works, and understand why these authors are famous and so influential, and then walk away from that with these ideas and examples in our minds so that we can practice them, use them, and develop them in our own communication. That's the difference between being a real student of literature and being a mere child who's consuming content and seeking to be entertained. That's what we seek to promote in our English literature courses, and I hope that this video gives you an idea of how students can go about studying these works and answering these questions as we work through English literature together. Now, I know that that's a lot of content crammed into 43 minutes. I know that that would be difficult for younger students to be able to listen to and follow. I know that students might have to watch this video 10 times before they really get it, but that's why I put it into video form. If you have any questions about these things or would like me to clarify anything, just get in touch. But that should provide a good overview of what I mean when I ask students to find examples of figures of speech in the works that we read in English literature. I hope that's helpful. God bless.